Welcome. Thank you for joining us to share the art of Fran Forman. Let me introduce Fran and her friend and colleague, David Weinberg. Please note that their biographies are listed in the invitation for today's WebinART. One of the joys and privileges of the gallery has been the opportunity to discover art and artists whose works stop us and astonish us. When we are suddenly captured by a fresh vision and a new perspective on life, and the art that can illuminate it, it renews our desire to be led into a new universe of feelings and experiences. Art at its best should astonish and awaken us to the experiences and the opportunities that make life more meaningful and engaging. I say all of this after more than 60 years of being astonished. We first met Fran through dear friends, after which she sent us a brief note of one of her images. And although it was only 6 years ago, the following work of hers deeply engaged us. The Carousel Escape from 2012. It resonated with our long-standing interest in the amazing and magical art of Ali. Ali's early work in cloth purported to portray the circus, but fundamentally evoked the mysterious inner search for connections in our world. These early views of Fran's work and her art created a similar response in us. Fran had already mastered the ability to use images to create collages of invitation and mystery. She has remained on this personal artistic journey in which she has not only refined her ability to seamlessly paint images, but throughout, she has continued to invest in each of her own works, her own search for the meaning of existence in our complex world. She is constantly driven to visually articulate her world of questions as portrayed with mysterious and engaging images. So far, we presented 3 exhibitions of Fran's art, and she has worked assiduously to share her work internationally with numerous exhibitions and the publication of 2 prize-winning volumes. Escape Artist, The Art of Fran Forman, published in 2014, and was chosen among the 10 best photo books of 2014 and other awards. And more recently, The Rest Between Two Notes, selected works by Fran Forman, published by Unicorn Publishing Group in 2020. Today, we're fortunate to have Fran and her colleague, David Weinberg, to explore and discuss her work and enlighten all of us along the way. As we talk, we shall share specific images and invite you to ask questions via the Q&A or the chat function, which Rose will interject throughout our conversation. Prior to this webinar, we asked participants who were interested to write a creative short story inspired by one of 3 images featured in the Self-Illumination exhibition catalog. And they're so noted. The gallery staff has selected one favorite story, which will be a winner and will receive a signed copy of Fran's most recent book. Now we'd like to begin. Those are the images that are on the screen of the works that people used as a means of creating their own story. Now we'd like very much to share with you a number of works as a chronological journey of Fran's artistic evolution. So let's proceed with the sharing of the images. So let me begin with a quote from Brother Thomas and then ask you, Fran, to talk a bit about it. Thomas wrote, "What there is still to see, we have not yet dreamed of." And so this first image, entitled Henri's Predator from 2012, is up for you. Fran?
This was created close to 10 years ago. And it was part of my early journey in which I was dealing more with magic than my current work, more with illusions, and also commenting on the relationship between man and beast. This early one is really a nod to Henri Rousseau. You might recognize the lion from his Sleeping Gypsy, but I'm also commenting on the word predator, wondering who the predator is here. Is it this beast of nature, or is it the soldier who has dominion over the lion? So these were early concerns I had. I still continue to have those and deal with them differently in my image making.
David, do you have thoughts about this particular piece?
Well, it's interesting that you even use the word magic, Fran, because when I look at this, the classification of magic realism as a school of art comes to mind, where it's kind of creating new realities. And also the phrase to make a photograph rather than take a photograph. And I think you've always been in the business of making photographs. Really, this could be done with painting or drawing or any other, but you've chosen to use photographic images to create these composites.
That's true. Yeah, I think of these really more as paintings in which instead of using paint on a brush, I'm using objects and photographs that have been captured by a camera, but that is true.
So do you have a catalog, and I don't mean a physical catalog, but a catalog digitally of images that you have been attracted to and are waiting to call upon them?
Yes, absolutely. And I've been keeping that catalog since the 90s. It became digital maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But yes, and I start with a thought sometimes, maybe an unconscious thought, maybe it hasn't been articulated, but then I start moving images from my various different catalogs, looking for relationships, trying to tell a story. Sometimes it's not clear to me what that story is until it's completed. But in this case, this particular one, since I've always been concerned about the relationship of man and nature, this was fairly clear. This was illuminated in my brain even before I started working on this. I'm not sure it's visible to the viewer now, but there's a star map that overlays the sky. And it's again, the sense of trying to unite the creatures of the earth with the larger universe. So there are many pieces of this particular image that have been part of my oeuvre for a couple decades.
The nice thing for me about having it on my screen, and I mentioned this to David earlier, is that you can actually see that star map. It's very clear in the image that I'm looking at, and by having the images surrounded by the dark, the image pops on the screen that I'm seeing. So the star map is very apparent. The bird creating a sense of movement, moving across this, allows our eye to converge as the two mountains or forms come together and bring us down to the animal itself. So there is an artistic composition that informs this, as well as an emotional or psychological composition that you bring to it.
And also notice that the bird is actually a white dove, which is its own metaphor in itself. So yeah, there are a lot of pieces to this.
And so if people, Rose, have questions along the way, they should certainly send them in. And we're going to, at this point, though, move on to the next one. The chair, with the parentheses around it, absence, from 2012. And David, when we met briefly the other time, you had some, I think, rather nice thoughts about this. So if you want to share those, and then we'll move from there.
Well, I think it shows up a lot in Fran's work, the theme of portals. And you're very explicit about it in the more recent work, but even in this earlier work, there's an interesting portal here. The back of the chair basically serves as a portal to the outside world. So I think that in almost all your images, there's some other point of entry into some other world. And for a lot of symbolic work, it could be symbolic of entry into the spiritual realm, from the real world into the spiritual. So I don't know, Fran, if that's an accurate perception of your work, but you might.
Yeah, I think that is accurate, but more than portal, the through line that continues into what I'm doing now and has become more apparent later is the sense of absence and departure. So this is a chair that is obviously had been used for many, many years. It's slightly decrepit. You're right, it's a portal into somewhere, but it's also waiting for someone or someone has departed. So you'll see some of those themes later in my work as well.
But as you referred to the later work, I just want to refer to the notion of shadows and light and dark, which doesn't appear as strongly and as dominantly in these works, these two that we've looked at so far, as they do in the most recent exhibition. And so the contrast between light and dark and the fact that so much takes place because of the shadow, not in the shadow. So this becomes a much more sculptural, singular presence where there is no one. And I'm looking somewhat directly at the opening, and it also gives the feeling that the backing of the chair has been ripped out. There's a jagged edge, at least as I see it, around the square empty space that creates the frame onto the landscape. So there's a little sense of unease when I see that in this otherwise, you know, a somewhat ancient chair, but the notion of use that you mentioned before feels almost somewhat much sadder, much more promptly destroyed, I guess, by someone. It just didn't fall apart.
No, that's true. And you're right, it is a jagged edge. But this is where I'm beginning to think about shadows, to use shadows almost as a character in my work. Yeah, so you can see it starting to become dominant in my images. You see that more in the more current images.
So Brother Thomas had another quote. Actually, there'll be three altogether, but every one of them seems to me to apply to this journey we're talking about. And he wrote, "Only those who risk going too far can possibly learn how far one can go."
I love that. That's
and,
yeah.
And it just seemed to me to create for us the opportunity to further explore your own personal journey. The next one is the Canyon in the Night, from what's dated as 2013, but it sounds like these, they get their dates whenever you feel like giving them. So,
true. Yeah, right. These images are worked on over several years, quite often.
So Rose, can you put that up? Canyon in the Night, 2013. Thank you. Very nice. So there certainly is your star map, among other things, Fran, but if you want to talk about it, there's a kind of, we maybe 6 years ago visited Ephesus, and then we've also been to Petra, where these amazing formations, those man-made, exist, and they seem eternal in a way. They seem as a presence of the absence of human beings, but at the same time, the understanding that humans inhabited these spaces. So this piece has both a sense of emptiness and at the same time, a very rich sense of presence to me.
So these were actually not man-made. These are canyons right. From Utah, actually, but several different canyons that I put together basically for the composition. But there's a majestic quality to it, which I think also speaks to the majesty of the universe, which is above it. The fact that there's a grid with a circle connecting, I assume that's the moon, could be Mars, I'm not really sure, somehow pulls it all together. And I don't usually overlay my images with these man-made grids, but I think it's I really don't know. I mean, it was obviously an unconscious move on my part, but I think what I was trying to suggest on some level was the logic and the harmony between what exists on the earth that's natural and what exists on the universe that's mysterious. So there is that attempt to suggest some kind of harmony and logic in this. and beauty, beauty in
David?
nature.
David?
That almost looks like an eclipse, a
Mm.
lunar eclipse, a solar eclipse, I'm sorry.
But there is also the linear presence of the grid and even the semicircle holding the moon or star or intersecting with it. And it's very interesting for me to at least see that clarity. And yet nature has this spectacular irregularity. And you, by being able to manipulate here, the shadows especially, you begin to move toward what I think you're now doing, because there's a mysterious quality that takes place within the sculptural presence of those forms that makes it very, very interesting to almost want to be there. And then on the other level, to talk just a little bit about the universe and climate accords and the degradation of our universe that we as human beings are perpetrating on it. And this image brings to mind that too, the clarity of the sky and the grid, and then what nature itself erodes, but at its own pace. And now we're accelerating that. So it has a lot of other resonances for me, Fran, in an important way. And I don't know about for you.
No, I think that's true. And the fact that the mountainscape in the background, the very background, is black, I think further suggests what you're expressing, that there is some concern about what's happening. Now, this was made almost a decade ago when I was certainly aware of the effects of climate change, but not as panicked about it as we are now. So I guess in some ways this was fairly prescient.
Right. David, one further thought, or we're going to move to a really wonderful piece that I like.
On a psychological level, I find it interesting that the moon, which is usually a feminine symbol, dominates the scene here. And there's some, the rocks are more masculine in their form. And I'm mentioning it now because I think that it plays into some of your later, the more recent work that you're doing. Because early on, a lot of your work had a very feminine quality in terms of the types of images and the composition. And I think the moon here, again, is like a symbol of femininity, but there's a transition going on toward more masculine type images in terms of geometry, etc. So we can.
The intersection of both of them.
Yep.
Well, I have to say, if that was something in my head, it was very unconscious, but I do see what you're talking about.
Well, as long as it's not X-rated, we can go to the next one.
X-rated.
Yeah, X-rated. This is, I think, an absolutely beautiful piece. And the issue of your ability to create a seamless, improbable, a non-existent world, and yet make it convincing, comes through in this piece very strongly for me. The arrangement of the flowers, the light on the centerpiece, the shapes themselves, the forms, the intersection within them at the top where you've got this sort of cutout circle, and then you could have left it without that element. But by putting it there, you create a sense of illusory space. So there's an enormous amount going on in this piece for me, and the issue of shadows, but very different shadows. These are softer shadows than the later shadows that we'll be looking at. So now it's up to you, Fran.
Well, this is around the time that I was becoming much more interested in geometry, or more consciously using geometry in my work, and also looking for architectural places that could resonate in one way or the other. This building was actually in Mexico that I shot a couple of years ago, that obviously I've manipulated a lot. But I'm beginning to play with shapes in a way that becomes much more apparent, especially as I become more enamored of Edward Hopper. This is really the beginning of that period, and I think you can probably see that, Bernie, that shapes become characters in my image making. So have circles, rectangles, curves, as well as color and shadows. You'll see much more of this in my contemporary work.
So
I also find it very interesting the way you've arranged the flowers, because there is it draws your eye into the image coming from the left. So, and it's an important compositional element in terms of how your eye travels through the image. And I just love the way it leads you in toward the center of the image and toward that open rectangle.
Towards the
Correct.
sky. It leads you to the sky.
But you've created a very strong vertical with the black lamp outline. So that in a way does, if it had continued all the way down, it would have broken into two pieces, but it doesn't. But it does create this axis that gives you the sense of kind of stability in the forms themselves. And yet it's only maybe a third of the space, the black and the lamp itself. So there's a lot of interesting kinds of things going on. And I think the shapes and forms that you referred to really are incredibly effective in this piece. And yet, and I remember this years ago when we had one of Ali's pieces in the gallery, and it was of people on very, very long poles, and a Russian art critic had come in and he says, "No good." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "There's no shadow for the person on the pole." I said, "You know, this is a work of art." And I think that's true of this as well, that you're making decisions to recreate this as a completed image, and it's a work of art. You're not trying to take us to a specific place in a physical sense. You're taking us there both in a visionary sense and an unconscious sense that we can then engage with the mystery of the space itself.
Well, it also reminds me a bit of Magritte's painting, where he has there's a house with a sky, and the house it's a night scene, and the sky is a daytime scene. This has that slightly surreal quality to it, just because of the contrast from bottom to top.
I agree with that. And one of the elements of the surrealist is to somehow connect with aspects of who we are unconsciously and make it seem like it's real. Then we find ourselves in a bind, because then we have to figure out what reality really is. And maybe we don't want to do that at all.
Well, that's also my understanding of magic realism. So it looks at first glance like it might be something you'd see in real life, but the careful observer will see that there's no way that that could exist in reality. So there is some illusion connected to what appears to be real.
So we're going to move on with this one final quote of Thomas's, but I just want to say the sort of visual, and obviously we chose individual pieces to talk about, so it's a loaded argument. It's not really fair, but there is a stark difference, I guess is the way I would put it, between the few pieces we've seen up until now, going back to the carousel escape, and now finding ourselves in a very different zone. And Thomas wrote, "It is amazing how our shadows fall in places we ourselves cannot go." Now, he wasn't writing about your work specifically, but the combination of the word ourselves and shadows seem to be part of the self-illumination body of work that we're now showing and that you've just created, and how to begin talking about it. Beside Hopper, Hopper's lovely, and you know his work is very engaging, but my understanding and appreciation of your work is much more dedicated to you and your neshama. What makes you different from any other human being is your spirit. And then how do you as an artist engage that, present it, share it in an authentic way, so that then we're engaged with you in that same journey. So that's enough of me. You go ahead.
Well, I just want to point out also, this has been helpful for me because I can see that there is a connecting tissue between the very first image that you showed, Carousel Escape, and this one, not necessarily visually, but metaphorically. Here's a woman sitting forlorn on a bed, but she has two suitcases by her side, and it's almost as if she's ready to escape too, and we don't know where. And it's a continuation of that theme, which runs through all of my work. Again, departure, leaving, absence. There's certainly a sense of absence here. And once again, the shadows become part of another character that become part of the image.
Well, Carl Jung had a lot to say about shadows in terms of personality. And he always talked about the shadow self, which was that aspect of your personality or your character that was the part you didn't like to recognize or confront. And somehow embracing that and making it part of who you are, for him was a big part of the process of becoming a complete person. So I see a lot.
It's also it's also a benefit that artists have because they can release the shadow self through their art and keep it hidden when we're out in public. So there is that opportunity to keep it under wraps. That's true. Oh, I just want to point out, this image was completed this summer when we were locked down. So the background image, the empty streetscape, is really a reflection of the lockdown that we've all been experiencing and will continue to experience for the next few months. The desolation in the cityscape, the absence of people in the cityscape. That's also a big part of what I'm trying to say here in this image.
So I'm all the way back, not to the shadows, but to the light. And so what has engaged me with this is the corner of light at the end of the bed closest to the wall. And that shape, that triangle, which then resonates with the one on the wall behind her. Because I'm interested in this, Fran, not only in terms of what you're trying to say, what you think is part of who and what you are, but also what holds it together visually. And so if you see those two forms bouncing off of one another, one a very large dominant form, but what sparkles is that small triangle on the floor. Mm-hmm. And once you move from there to the windowsill, to the outline of the white on the exterior of the light in the piece, then although for you it is a departure, there's also a sense of illumination, which is in the title of the show as well, except it's self-illumination, that makes this not as foreboding as one would have expected when I first looked at it. There is an energy visually in the space. And I understand your reference to the lockdown and so forth, but at the same time, that also provides you with a grid of stability visually against all the other diagonal lines that are in this. So it's a work of art. In addition to trying to share angst and concern and loneliness and isolation and escape, in order for it to work on those levels, it also has to be a work of art.
Thank you, but don't forget the splash of light, the wedge of light behind the table, the night table.
It's also, it works, but it goes through the whole thing. And then it ends up as a vertical sort of slash of light on the curtain. It's not a triangle there, but there's a kind of illumination there that takes place at the same time. So there is in this an enormous amount, and creating the suitcases in the foreground, but they're in shadow. They're not the dominant feature at all in the piece, but they also create a visual weight that enables it all to settle on that floor. So the figure without those suitcases, I think, would be a very different image as a work of art. And it's, I think, a remarkably powerful piece that you've created. The next one is Study in Aqua and Pink, but I think it's much more than a color exercise. So I'm going to let you talk about it, Fran, and then we'll respond.
This is a continuation of my early experiments with shape, but also using shadow and shape and geometry and architecture as a way to tell a story. So it's really a continuation of work or experiments that I've been kind of playing with all along. Again, some of the same metaphors, absence, departure, but also there's a strength and a logic and a harmony to the geometry. And to be honest, this is a fairly straight photograph. I did not add anything. There's no compositing done on this photograph, but I accentuated what I saw was the strength of the actual pieces within that geometry.
And this is a little bit of a departure in that you don't have any people. And
I have no people.
Figures. Is that a deliberate departure for you?
Yes, it is a departure. And of course, initially I tried adding people. I tried adding other objects. I tried adding, well, other people in movement. But it was such a strong image that it really didn't need anything else. And at some point, as every artist knows, you have to know when to stop and when to subtract. So this was a case of addition and then subtraction until I went back to the original geometry and highlighted the geometry and the strength of this composition.
So this is one of the few pieces the Russian art critic would have liked.
We're talking about the process. I'm noticing that we're getting a lot of questions about your process in making these photos, as I'm sure you've been asked many times. But would you mind maybe speaking a little bit to that?
So, Rose, let's go back to the image before, which I think will be easier for Fran to talk about since this one belies that. Fran, do you want to talk a bit about this
Sure.
one in terms of process?
Yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on process because it's fairly technical, but this is a photo composite or a montage, which means that I've taken photographs of existing objects, existing places, and in the case of this image, that model. I've taken them at various different places, different times, sometimes different lighting conditions, and then cut them away from their original backgrounds and collage them together. It's not as straightforward as it sounds because one has to consider light and proportion, shadows. There are a lot of components that have to go into it. So the process is called, I should also add that this is all done digitally. All the images are captured in my camera, uploaded to my computer. I cut away, I subtract, I manipulate, and then I start pulling pieces together. It's almost like being a choreographer who's working out a piece of a ballet. And the choreographer has dancers in front of her, and she's moving them around like sprites on a stage, trying to see where the relationship is of this dancer to that dancer, of all the dancers together with the background, what kind of story she wants to tell. So that's a little bit of how I can explain this. It's fairly time consuming. I always try or often try to reference other artists, other art forms, because I don't take any credit for necessarily originality. We're all dependent on what came before us. So I do make a nod to earlier artists, different kinds of art forms, different periods of art, and combine them in a way that organically seems to work to tell a story.
A question, Fran, showed up, I saw on the screen. Did you pose this model in this, or this is just one of a number of images you had available and you said, I'm going to put her in this?
Yeah, I'm not as logical as actually posing her in this. She was shot several years ago before I started working on this image.
Okay.
And I keep a large archive of models of people, of objects, of places, etc. And sometimes I'm able to find a match. And in this case, I was. But of course, I had to do quite a few changes with her to make her fit in here. And I did a fair amount of work on her to have her fit at this point. I also had to manipulate the bed to make it appear as if she's actually sitting at the corner of the bed. So
this is free plastic surgery?
yes, it is.
That's it. Very good for you. Rose, is there another question that you think is relevant to this image?
Someone wrote, is it possible that the woman in Alone at the Southwest Motel has just arrived at the motel room? So I think this person's sort of wondering if you envision a story when you kind of create these images.
You know, that's a good question. I wasn't that specific. She's either recently arrived or she's about to leave. So it's clear that it's either arrival or departure. Oh, I also want to add, by the way, that the background image, the building, the decrepit building, was shot several years ago in Selma, Alabama. And it just seemed appropriate for this time to put that in the window.
Interesting. So you, in a way, have a diary of images. And instead of having them dated, you can update them or reintegrate them into your vision of the moment. But I
Yes.
want to go back to the issue of the title, really, which is self-illumination. And at least for me, the Carousel Escape or Henri's Predator are artistic expressions, but less about you or less about your inner self than these more recent pieces. And so I don't know if you're interested in or willing to talk a little bit about your own personal journey. I certainly realize as we keep getting older, Sue and I, that questions like this are relevant. We are on a journey, and there is an end point. So mortality, absence sounds like an interesting sort of phrase when you're 30 or 40. Absence when you're 60, 70, 80, 90 has a whole different resonance. So I'd be interested in how you feel your work is reflecting where you are today.
Well, the first thing I want to mention about self-illumination is that I think all art is in some ways a self-illumination, but that's a different story. Yeah, I think that's true. The early work that I did, that I started to, I mean, I've been using this method of creating art for 30 some years, over 30 years, but I've become much more interested in self-reflection over the last 15 years. And at that point, it was really more about whimsy, fantasy. There was something magical and almost joyous about that earlier work that over time, a different set of priorities started to creep in, which I haven't really thought about, but I do see it in my work. It's almost as like, as we age, it's like when we age, or at least when I age, I feel like I need more salt in my food. I need more spice. And now in terms of making art, I feel like I need more color. I need more dramatic contrast. I need more shadow. And it's an acceptance of morbidity. It's also a reflection of personal family crises, of the political situation that's happened, the anxiety that we've all felt over the past several years. There's no question that in some ways my work has become, I wouldn't say more grim, but more expressive of inner turmoil and of acceptance of my aging process. I would hope that I can continue this well into my 80s and my 90s. I can't imagine ever stopping. I hope that's not the case. I'm kind of curious to know how my art will change over time. But right now, I feel very much indebted to the artists who have used strong splashes of color, but also chiaroscuro, because I need those heavy contrast of shadow and light. And that probably is something to do with aging. I hate to admit it, but I think it might be true.
Well, let me just share with you another Thomas's quotes, which I hadn't really thought about until you were talking. And he said at one point, memory is more permanent than matter. And by that, I think he was constantly referring to the fact that by re-engaging with images, memories, if you will, that at the end of the day, those experiences that those memories capture do inform us throughout our entire lives, however long that is. And the issue of mortality is ever present for all of us. Sam Bach constantly says to me, you know, Bernie, there are fewer days ahead of me than behind me, and he's only 87. So the notion that the journey is what we've got in front of us and behind us. So that by having the storage area of your images creates for you a source of memory. And in doing that, then you've been able to access that memory and then share your images, but at the same time, if they are personal enough, then they're universal. And so that you're searching for and trying to express as best you can the things that you just referred to, both inner turmoil, external turmoil, chaos, all the things that we have experienced as a country and as a world in these past 3, 4, 5 years, come out in the work.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say to you is that it would be nice if all artists did reflect in their work who they were. a lot of them are using art as a vehicle for other means. But I think in this case, and for the most part, the artists in the gallery are those people who are seeking to share who they are through their art. And so there is an authenticity about their work, just as the show that's accompanying yours, Pat Keck, is when I think of her work, the one thing that comes to mind immediately is not scary zombies and all, it's authentic. It grows out of who the person is, and in doing that, it is specific, but it's universal. So Rose, you're on for a minute with the contest and the short story. And I love all three images that were proposed as possible story incitors.
Yes, so here are the three photos that could be served as inspiration for people who wanted to submit a short story, 1,500 words or less. And just due to time, I'm only going to be reading one of them, and I'll say the name at the end to, just have suspense for everyone. But it is based off of Alone in the Southwest Motel, so I'll put that back on the screen so maybe people can kind of envision it a little bit more. Alone in a Southwest Motel. On the day that the Department of Children's Services came in to terminate parental rights, she did not join in the keening, the crying, the threatening. Her roommate at the rehab center leaned over and patted her on the hand. "If it weren't for how big your hands are, no one would ever know," she said. It was a compliment, or meant to be. "Thank you," she said as she took it as a compliment. "When your kids are 18, they can come find you, It happens all the time," said the roommate, although doubting in the moment what she said when the words came out. "What would I even say to them?" Louisa looked at the clock. "Whatever. You're still very beautiful. You know that, right? And I'm sorry I didn't want to be your roommate when I first found out, but now it doesn't matter." Louisa shook her head. "I know, I understand." The photo of her two children was turned upside down on her thigh, and the paperwork was already signed and piled next to her on the bed. Her suitcase, the big old one that her father had given her, him actually, when he left when he left El Paso. The one with her father's name, Louis, monogrammed in gold and mostly worn off. It was packed on the floor and too heavy for a woman to carry. She often thought about getting something lighter, more feminine, but instead added an A after the Louis in black Sharpie and felt fortunate that she could carry it without a problem. There was nothing else of her father now, except the heavy black hair inherited and a cause for great gratitude, long enough now to braid down her back and remind her of her grandmother. Her parents had never met their grandchildren, as Louisa, still junior, had married right out of the service and fathered two boys without mentioning the other urges that underpinned everything, and that would soon upend the already fragile marriage before any visits back to Texas could be arranged. In treatment group, Louisa spoke of desperation, of shame. We know, said the other women in the circle around her. God grant me, they repeated. The alcohol has soothed them, the oxys altered, the meth offered motivation where there was only inertia. Cocaine broke the isolation. By the time Junior's wife had found him in her green skirt, ridiculous on the cocktail of chemicals, she had already moved the children into her parents' guest room, not even knowing to the full extent of what she considered a betrayal of all that she had dear, at least briefly. High on cocaine and calmed on alcohol, Junior felt the clarity to understand the level of betrayal the crapshoot of gender had leveled at him. Negotiations ensued. By this time, for Louisa, there was no turning back. But she could get clean. They could still be a family. Maybe, said the wife, and Louisa was dropped off at the rehab, already sick from withdrawal, but relieved that they at least had a plan. The wife did not want the skirt back. The rehab offered a large wardrobe closet with garments left from others who had either succeeded or not. Louisa carefully washed a dark green bra from Victoria's Secret and hung it to dry in the shared bathroom. After a bit, a few of the other women in the rehab donated pieces here and there, no longer worried that what was once a man was in their midst, as Louisa, as she expressed deep and sympathetic understanding for the trauma these women had gone through at the hands of men. I've seen things, Louisa said of her time off at war. They settled into the routine of early recovery. In the evening, Louisa's friends gave her makeup tips and sometimes they even laughed. They all talked about their children, the ones waiting and the ones gone. They talked about resiliency of kids and that love always wins. Keeping it real, one day at a time, they reminded each other. The wife's lawyer made hasty work of the proposed annulment and threatened charges and appropriated benefits from the wife's parents, and the wife's parents were thrilled with the new arrangement, having the children under their roof. So there were a few phone calls in Louisa's counselor's office, and Louisa, still rocky with anxiety and overwhelmed by brain fog, agreed. Whatever. The counselor suggested that this was all pretty quick. She may have used the term bum's rush, but before they knew it, the papers were served and Louisa's discharge date was scheduled. The motel across from the intensive outpatient program office was secured under a state grant, and Louisa hugged her new friends, who called out, "Make it work. It works if you work it," with promises of phone calls once they all got settled and 12-step meetings. For a moment, Louisa felt anything was possible.
Wow.
So that is the work by Nina Gabby. Congratulations on your short story. It was a pleasure to read. I think we can all say that was really fun and interesting and intense. But thank you for your submission and congratulations.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you, Nina. Fran, I would think if I were you, having listened to the story, to realize that something I had created something as wonderful as that. It must bring you great pleasure.
It absolutely does. No, I love how people look at a work of art and bring themselves into it and create something of their own. It's what every artist hopes for.
So I think that for me is a wonderful way for us to just say thank you to everyone who has been with us for this. Glad that we all made it, and look forward to future opportunities to come together. Fran, congratulations. David, thank you so much. Rose, thank you again, and goodbye to everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.